In this lecture, we're going to be looking at Chapter 2 of the text concerning police history. Early history, and we're basically talking about policing history in England, developed as a need for it emerged. Early system of policing was based on the Franken Pledge, which basically meant that small villages, small areas, groups of 10 people would sort of form units, and then you could have 10 of those units in a larger unit, just sort of a way of grouping the local people in rural areas in a system to provide um, law enforcement and also referral to the judiciary system, which again was developing during the same time period. One of the major things that early they were law enforcement agencies in that they were preventing break-ins and burglaries and things like that in the business district. But one of the major things that Night's Watch did was to watch out for fires. Fires are a very big issue in areas, again, and it became more of a problem as cities grew larger, where there's not any mechanical way to pump water. Fires can spread very quickly and be very devastating for areas. So that was one of the first tasks, and probably the most important task of early Night's Watch, were to watch out for fires, in addition to criminal activity in business districts where there were an absence of people at night. So again, from the Franken Pledge, as areas, one of the larger units grouping the smaller areas into what are called shires, which is where we get the term sheriff from, shire reeve, as a law enforcement official that would oversee that particular grouping in the Franken Pledge system. One of the advancements in organized police forces came in London, other larger cities at the time, in the form of what we call thief takers. And these were basically just bounty hunters. The government did not have a police force or a law enforcement agency beyond the military, so they would put bounties on people, and the thief takers would collect the bounties. The London Metropolitan Police Force is one of the first major police forces separate from the military. It was funded by Parliament around the second half of the 1820s. It was, again, counter to the military, which is why they wear blue uniforms instead of red uniforms like the military wore. It was headed by Sir Robert Peel, which is why they call the I didn't turn off my ringer. They didn't. They call them peelers or bobbies. They were also unarmed, as most police officers in the UK are today. They're unarmed because that's not their major function, is to get into a weapons battle with criminals. In the United States, we see a mirroring of the system that was in place in England at the time when our government was originally founded, and then sort of refounded over the course of the 1700s. So the early American systems look much like the British systems. The sheriff overseeing a larger area. When you get to urban environments, that's where we see those London metropolitan type police forces form. New York, Philadelphia, Boston were some of the first places that had those. In the South, some of the first organized law enforcement agencies were slave patrols, aimed at enforcing the ownership rights of slave masters at the time. It's important to note that when you look at the historical context of the relationship between the police and community members, particularly minority community members in the South. As we had westward expansion over the course of the 1800s, as a need for law enforcement developed, that's what happened. So you had sheriffs forming in areas that saw that, and then you would have federal marshals overseeing a larger territory, maybe 10, 20 sheriffs in a particular geographical area, just as what was needed sort of developed. We also have a few particular eras in American policing, and again, originally this is talking about major urban police forces in the probably from Chicago east. Originally in the political era, though by the end of the political era, the corruption and graft has made its way to Los Angeles. The political era was hallmarked by intense negative inner workings between the police and other government officials, in that the police were basically just a gang. Uh, they did all kinds of illegal activity. People were hired because of who their family members were, not based on their merit or their ability at their job. And it took a long time, about 100 years, if you look at from the early 1820s through the 1920s, to change that, to remove the political stench that was associated with police at that time, and then we move into the professional era. And in an effort to remove all of the corruption and graft, they sort of went too far, and they removed all the familiarity that the police had with a particular area. So the police didn't know who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. They would drive in their cars in an area. There were less foot beat patrols. They could cover more ground that way, but again, they didn't know who was who in the neighborhood. There were some positive aspects of the professional era: increased focus on education, increased training, increased incorporation of technology like the cars, radios, and things like that. Um, we were sort of realizing that there was a problem, that the police didn't know who was who in a community, and they tried to fix that with the community era of policing, which started in the late 1960s, 1970s. We're trying to refamiliarize the police with the neighborhoods, and that still goes on in certain areas today. But at the same time, starting in about the late 1970s, early 1980s, we see the war on drugs kick up and the militarization of police happen. So we have these two conflicting models: the community era of policing and the militarization of policing happening at the same time. And it's made it very difficult for police to have any sort of reform or to make the system better. Local police are set up, and I mean, probably fairly familiar with how this looks. You have city police in cities that are large enough to have a police force. Then you have county police that are going to monitor the entire county. They're going to monitor areas that have city police forces, areas that don't have city police forces. Sometimes the county agency is the police department. Sometimes it's the sheriff's department. Sometimes they have both. Sometimes they also have a marshal service. It just depends on what the needs are for that county. Typically, if they have both, like in, for instance, Gwinnett County has a police force and a sheriff's department. The sheriff's department maintains the courts, the jails. They don't really go out and arrest people. They serve warrants, things like that, but they don't do traffic control, things like that. You also have state agencies. Most states have a highway patrol monitoring the traffic flow in those particular areas. They also have state police or state bureaus of investigation. Sometimes they have both, again, just depending on what the need for those areas are. And those are agencies that are going to do things like investigate very high-profile incidences, investigate misconduct by police, and things like that. In the federal system, these are some of the larger agencies. The U.S. Marshal Service was the first federal law enforcement agency. They handle, much like a sheriff's department would, they handle the operations of the courthouses. They also do prisoner transport. They also do prisoner recovery. They also do asset protection. So they work as bodyguards for federal judges, districts. What is it? Basically the federal prosecutors in an area if they need protection. You also have the postal inspectors. They work in conjunction with FBI, DEA, on some particular cases, people trying to move contraband through the mail. They also do a lot of investigation of child pornography cases because those offenders have gone low tech and use the postal service to send things like hard copies of pictures and low tech videos and things like that. to the Secret Service, which has two tasks. The one you're probably familiar with, protecting high value assets. So the marshals do the bulk of the federal protection, but the top tier is handled by the Secret Service. They also do anti-counterfeiting measures. So they investigate counterfeiters and try to prevent people from using counterfeiting to manipulate American currency. The FBI was created in the 1920s to combat rising interstate crime that was taking place. There wasn't any sort of ability of police to investigate crimes from one state to another because they lost jurisdiction. So the FBI was formed to prevent that. DEA was formed in the early 1970s as a conglomeration of a lot of federal law enforcement agencies that already existed that were concerned with drug enforcement. Um, the ICE and Border Patrol have been. Border Patrol's newer. ICE has been around for longer in various aspects, customs enforcement. Um, Border Patrol was really expanded a lot in the first decade of the 21st century, and unfortunately, they didn't do as thorough of a job in vetting the employees, and so we've seen a lot of problems and a lot of corruption with Border Patrol in bringing contraband over, bringing refugees, bringing well, I mean, a lot of the people that come over illegally are refugees. So basically, human trafficking they're involved in, and that's becoming a pretty big issue right now. And then you also have National Parks Police, which deal with law enforcement on national parks land. It's not a very glamorous job, but it is important to prevent that from happening. One of the major issues that they deal with is the cultivation of illegal marijuana on national parks land. The reason that people grow weed on national parks land is if they get caught, the government can't seize land that they already own. So places like Kentucky, you see a lot of marijuana cultivation on state-owned and federally government-owned land because they don't want to get their land seized if they grow the weed on their own property. So again, just kind of an overview of law enforcement agencies and what they look like in practice. Make sure you read the text and watch the other linked videos on this week's to-do list and finish the discussion questions.